It all started with something so small, so insignificant in the grand scheme of things, that I didn't think twice about it, moving my ranch-style mailbox just 3 feet down the driveway. It was a harmless adjustment, or so I thought. Our house sat comfortably on a quiet suburban street, the kind where everyone knows each other by name, and the neighbors wave when you pull out of the driveway. The mailbox, an old-fashioned metal post with a red flag, had stood in its spot for years, close enough to the curb to be easily reached by the mail carrier, but, as I had discovered, right in the path of a constant stream of neighborhood kids playing on bikes, scooters, and skateboards. My wife and I had noticed a couple of close calls, kids swerving to avoid the mailbox, scraping their knees on the pavement, and honestly, it just seemed smarter to nudge the mailbox a bit further away from the street to make the area safer. 3 feet didn't seem like much, just enough to create a safer buffer zone for the neighborhood kids without interfering with mail delivery. I grabbed my tools one Saturday morning, intending to do a quick shift of the mailbox post. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic. I figured the HOA rules might have something about mailbox placement. But since the move was so minor and since it didn't change the style or the appearance, I didn't think it would raise any eyebrows. I dug into the dirt, loosened the post, and carefully moved the mailbox a few feet down the driveway. I stepped back to admire the small change, feeling like I'd just done something quietly responsible. A little safer for everyone, a little more considerate. Done. That's when the trouble started. By mid-afternoon, I got a call from my neighbor, Karen. Now, Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-appointed HOA watchdog, the person who carried around a clipboard like a badge of honor and made it her personal mission to enforce every rule, guideline, and policy, no matter how trivial or petty. "You moved your mailbox without approval," Karen said sharply. "That's a violation of HOA rules. You're supposed to get permission first. We're going to have to report this." I was stunned. "Karen, it's just 3 feet. It doesn't change the look or style. It's safer for the kids." I didn't think this would be a big deal. Karen's tone hardened. "Rules are rules. You can't just do whatever you want. We have standards here." Before I could respond, I heard the unmistakable sound of a police siren outside. Confused, I stepped out onto the porch, and sure enough, a patrol car rolled slowly by. I assumed it was unrelated until I got a knock on the door a few minutes later. There, standing on my porch, was an officer. I blinked, confused and more than a little concerned. Why had the police come over for a mailbox? As it turned out, Karen had called the cops, claiming I was causing a public safety hazard by moving my mailbox without authorization. The officer was there to check things out. I was annoyed but tried to stay calm. "Officer, it's a private property matter. The mailbox was just moved a few feet. No harm done." The officer nodded, taking notes politely but seriously. The last thing I expected was the moment when my wife arrived home. She stepped out of the car in her police uniform, fresh from her shift at the department, and I immediately recognized that unmistakable look, calm authority mixed with a hint of amusement. Turns out my wife was the police chief, the very same woman who walked in, cool and composed, and took over the conversation. Karen's face turned pale when she realized who my wife was. And just like that, what started as a simple 3-foot move became a neighborhood drama none of us saw coming. After that bewildering encounter with the police at my doorstep, I thought things would settle down. I mean, it was just a mailbox, right? But as anyone who's ever dealt with an HOA, Homeowners Association, knows, the smallest changes can sometimes stir the biggest storms. Karen, our neighborhood's self-appointed rule enforcer, was not one to let things go easily. She had built her reputation on strict adherence to HOA covenants, bylaws, and guidelines. If there was a speck out of place, Karen was on it like a hawk. Some neighbors appreciated her vigilance, others found her a bit overbearing. I was quickly discovering I was in the latter camp. The very next day after the police visit, I received an official-looking letter in the mail. It was from the HOA board, but I knew exactly who was behind it. Karen. The letter accused me of violating several HOA rules, most notably, moving my mailbox without prior approval, creating a potential safety hazard, disregarding neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. The tone of the letter was formal but heavy with admonishment. The letter demanded that I restore the mailbox to its original position immediately or face further consequences. They warned about fines, possible liens on the property, and even potential legal action. I reread the letter several times, wondering if I had somehow walked into a Kafkaesque nightmare. It felt absurd. How could moving a mailbox 3 feet cause such an uproar? I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting to speak in my defense. But even before that, the neighborhood chatter had started. Some neighbors were siding with Karen, concerned about the precedent I might be setting. Others whispered support for me, but were hesitant to get involved, fearing HOA retaliation. I felt the weight of the whole situation more than I expected. What began as a practical decision to protect neighborhood kids was turning into a battle of wills. Karen's complaint had snowballed into a full-blown HOA overreach, and I was the reluctant defendant. At the next HOA meeting, held in the community clubhouse, the atmosphere was tense. Karen was there in full force, clipboard in hand, ready to present her case. She stood up, and with an air of self-righteousness, recounted the egregious violation I had committed. She painted a picture of me as a reckless homeowner flouting the rules and endangering the neighborhood's harmony. I took my turn to explain. I calmly detailed why I had moved the mailbox, safety concerns, no change in appearance, and no attempt to defy the HOA. I even mentioned that the post was still within the mail carrier's easy reach, a detail Karen conveniently ignored. Despite my explanation, Karen's influence was clear. The board seemed reluctant to dismiss her claims outright. Several members echoed her concerns, worried about opening the door to further unauthorized modifications. Then came the moment when I mentioned that my wife was the police chief. The room fell silent. Karen's face tightened, a flicker of something like discomfort crossing her features. She had no idea who I was married to until that very moment. The power dynamic suddenly shifted. My wife, who had arrived quietly and stood at my side, spoke up with the calm authority that comes from years in law enforcement. "This is a private property matter," she said firmly. "There is no violation of any city, state, or federal law here. The HOA may have guidelines, but they do not supersede reasonable safety concerns." Her words cut through the tension like a knife. Karen tried to maintain her composure, but the room had changed. The HOA board members looked uncertain, weighing the situation in a new light. I realized then that Karen's complaint, while rooted in strict rule enforcement, was also about control, about who had the power to decide what counted as acceptable in our neighborhood. In that moment, I understood that this was not just about a mailbox or even an HOA rule. It was about standing up to an overreach of authority and reminding everyone that the rules are meant to serve the community, not suffocate it. As the meeting wrapped up, the board agreed to postpone any action until they could review the situation further, thanks largely to my wife's presence and input. Walking home, I felt a mix of relief and determination. The battle wasn't over, but I knew I wasn't fighting alone. Karen's complaint had sparked a fight much bigger than a mailbox, and I was ready for whatever came next. The morning after the HOA meeting, I woke up hoping that the tension from the previous day would finally ease off. I wanted to get back to normal life, mow the lawn, fix a few things around the house, maybe enjoy a quiet weekend with my wife. But as I pulled back the curtains, I noticed a familiar sight that made my stomach drop. A police cruiser parked directly across the street from our house. My mind raced. Was Karen still stirring up trouble? Had she escalated this beyond the HOA board? The entire situation was starting to feel surreal, like a sitcom with an absurd plot twist. I stepped outside to see if the officer was there to talk. As I approached, the door to the cruiser opened and Officer Martinez stepped out. He was young but carried himself with professional calmness. I could tell he was here on official business, but also a bit hesitant. "Good morning," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "I'm here because we received a complaint regarding your mailbox." I blinked. "About my mailbox?" "Yes, ma'am. A neighbor reported that moving your mailbox has created a safety hazard. They were concerned it might interfere with the mail delivery or cause an accident on the street." I suppressed a chuckle. 3 feet, officer. I moved it 3 feet down the driveway to keep kids from running into it. It's safer now." He nodded and pulled out a small notebook. "I understand, but we have to check things out whenever a complaint like this comes in. The HOA filed a formal complaint, so the police department has to respond." This was the part that struck me most. How quickly a private neighborhood dispute had turned into a police matter. I tried to explain it was really an HOA issue, but Officer Martinez said he had to follow protocol. "I'll need to document the complaint and make sure there's no public danger." Before I could say more, my wife pulled up in her cruiser, fresh from her shift. I immediately relaxed a little. She was the calm center in any storm. "Morning," she said, stepping out in uniform. "I heard there was a call about our mailbox." I smiled. "You could say that. Karen called the cops on me for moving it." My wife raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by the absurdity. She introduced herself to Officer Martinez, and soon the 2 officers were inspecting the mailbox together, comparing its placement with standard regulations. As my wife took charge of the situation, I watched neighbors start to gather, some curious, some wary. Word travels fast when cops show up in a sleepy neighborhood. Karen appeared, clutching her clipboard with a look of triumph. "I told you this was serious," she said, glaring at me. My wife's expression didn't change. She calmly explained to Karen that while HOA rules should be respected, the police department's priority was public safety and legality, not petty disputes. She assured everyone that the mailbox posed no safety hazard. Karen sputtered, clearly caught off guard. The police chief was not exactly the opponent she expected. In the end, Officer Martinez filed a report, noting that no violation or danger was present. The police would not be involved further unless another legitimate safety concern arose. As the cruiser drove away, Karen muttered under her breath but didn't escalate further. That day taught me a powerful lesson. Sometimes people use authority to intimidate, but real authority means knowing when to step back. What started as a simple mailbox move became a test of patience, community, and understanding the limits of power. With my wife by my side, I felt ready to face whatever came next, even if it meant dealing with an overzealous HOA and a Karen with too much time on her hands. The name Karen had become almost legendary in our neighborhood, not because of any official position, but because of her reputation as the HOA's fiercest enforcer. After the police visit, I realized I was about to have a more direct encounter with her, and I wasn't exactly looking forward to it. Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was the embodiment of the HOA's iron fist. She prided herself on knowing every rule in the HOA handbook by heart, and she wielded her clipboard like a weapon. She seemed to believe that if she wasn't watching every move we made, the neighborhood would descend into chaos. The irony, of course, was that Karen's idea of order was sometimes overbearing, bordering on obsessive. She organized neighborhood inspection walks where she would critique freshly painted doors, manicured lawns, even flower beds. If you strayed from the HOA's prescribed color palette or planting scheme, Karen would make sure you heard about it. After the police incident, I had a feeling Karen was plotting her next move. So, when I saw her walking toward my house one afternoon, clipboard in hand and expression serious, I braced myself. "Good afternoon," she said with that familiar sharp tone. "I thought we should talk about the mailbox situation." I invited her onto the porch, trying to stay calm. "Sure, Karen. What's on your mind?" Karen wasted no time. "You know the rules require approval before making any changes to the exterior of your property, even something as small as moving a mailbox. It's about maintaining the neighborhood's look and safety standards." "I understand that," I said, "but the move was only 3 feet, and it made the area safer for kids riding their bikes. I didn't think it would be a problem." Karen's eyes narrowed. "It is a problem if it's done without permission. That's why we have processes. Besides, the letter from the HOA board isn't just about the mailbox's position. It's about precedent. If one person can ignore the rules, then others might start doing the same." I sighed. "Karen, I get that rules are important, but the mailbox wasn't moved to make a statement. It was moved for safety. Sometimes rules need to be flexible." Karen shook her head. "Rules are rules. Flexibility leads to chaos. Besides, I'm also here to ensure that all residents comply with our community standards. I'm not just enforcing the rules, I'm protecting property values." I felt a flicker of frustration but held my tongue. It wasn't worth escalating. "I appreciate your concern for the community, but I'd hoped we could find a way to address safety without turning it into a confrontation." Karen glanced at my wife, who had quietly stepped out onto the porch with us, still in uniform. Her usual confident demeanor faltered for a moment. I noticed the subtle shift. My wife smiled politely. "Safety is always a priority, and while HOA guidelines help maintain community standards, they can't override common sense." Karen's eyes flicked between us. It was clear she hadn't anticipated my wife's presence or the quiet authority she carried. For the first time, I saw hesitation in Karen's posture. "I just want what's best for the neighborhood," Karen said softly, almost as if trying to convince herself. "Of course," I said. "We all do. Maybe we can work together to ensure safety without unnecessary conflict." Karen nodded slowly, though I suspected the battle wasn't over. Still, that conversation felt like a small victory. The rigid enforcer was human after all, a woman who cared deeply about the community, but maybe needed a reminder that rules don't exist in a vacuum. Over the next few days, Karen's tone softened in subsequent interactions. She wasn't giving up her watchdog role, but she seemed less eager to escalate every minor infraction. I realized that Karen wasn't just a thorn in the neighborhood's side. She was also a product of the system, someone who saw order and rules as the backbone of community life. Still, I was glad to have my wife, the police chief, in my corner. Between her experience balancing authority and empathy and my attempts at diplomacy, maybe there was hope for peace. That afternoon, standing on the porch with Karen, my wife, and me, I felt a strange sense of unity, even if it was fragile and tentative. Sometimes it's not about winning battles, but about understanding what drives the people on the other side. And for Karen, it was control. The control that came from protecting what she believed was a shared dream of a perfect neighborhood. After that tense encounter with Karen, the self-appointed HOA enforcer, the neighborhood buzzed with a new energy, an undercurrent of curiosity and whispered conversations. You see, what nobody expected was the fact that my wife wasn't just any police officer. She was the police chief. It wasn't something we broadcasted loudly, My wife preferred to keep her professional life and our home life separate, especially in a neighborhood where everyone seemed to want to be involved in everyone else's business. But after Karen's complaint and the police involvement over my little mailbox move, the secret came out in a way that changed everything. The day after the HOA meeting and police visit, a few neighbors approached us with cautious smiles. Some offered tentative support, while others looked surprised when they realized who my wife was. Suddenly, I wasn't just the guy who had moved his mailbox without permission. I was married to the woman who wore the badge that symbolized law and order in our city. At first, I thought this might make things more complicated. After all, not everyone is comfortable with the idea of the police chief living in their neighborhood, especially when there are disputes that could involve legal or civic matters. But as the days went on, something unexpected happened. Neighbors started to see the situation differently. Where Karen had been the embodiment of strict enforcement, wielding HOA rules like a weapon, my wife brought a new perspective, one rooted in fairness, community safety, and practicality. One afternoon, as I worked on some yard repairs, Mr. Thompson from down the street came over. He was an older gentleman, usually quiet and reserved. "I heard about the mailbox incident," he said quietly. "I didn't realize your wife was the police chief. That changes things." "How so?" I asked, curious. "Well," he said, "it makes me feel like the neighborhood is safer knowing she's nearby, and it makes me think twice about jumping to conclusions about rules and complaints. Maybe there's room for common sense after all." I nodded, feeling a mix of pride and relief. My wife's role wasn't just a title, it was a source of reassurance. But it wasn't just neighbors who took notice. The HOA board, led by Karen, began to tread more carefully around us. Karen herself seemed to lose some of her usual bravado when speaking with my wife. The power dynamics had shifted. One evening, after a particularly long day, my wife and I sat on the porch, reflecting on everything that had happened. "I didn't expect the mailbox to cause so much drama," I said, shaking my head. She smiled. "It's never just about the mailbox. It's about control, authority, and sometimes fear of change. People cling to rules because it makes things predictable. Do you think Karen will back down? She'll adapt. She has to. But more importantly, the neighborhood will have to adapt too. With me here, it's harder for anyone to overstep without consequences." Her words carried weight. Being the police chief wasn't just about enforcing laws in the city, it was about embodying justice, fairness, and community leadership. And that meant balancing authority with empathy. The revelation of her position changed not only how neighbors saw us, but how we saw ourselves within the community. I began to understand that sometimes the most powerful influence isn't about issuing orders or enforcing rules. It's about leading by example, showing people that fairness and understanding can coexist with discipline. Karen's calls and complaints didn't stop entirely, but they became less frequent and less aggressive. The neighborhood slowly began to settle into a new rhythm, one where the HOA rules mattered, but so did common sense and neighborly respect. And all because of a mailbox moved 3 feet, and a police chief who knew when to stand firm and when to extend a hand. That big reveal wasn't just a moment of surprise, it was the beginning of a new chapter for our neighborhood, and for us. After the big reveal about my wife's role as the police chief, I thought the worst of the mailbox drama would fade. I was wrong. If anything, the tension ratcheted up, especially at the next HOA meeting. The community clubhouse was buzzing that evening when I arrived. The room was packed with neighbors, some curious, some clearly on edge. The air was thick with anticipation. Everyone wanted to see how things would unfold now that the police chief was part of the neighborhood drama. Karen was already there, sitting at the front table with the other HOA board members, her clipboard neatly stacked with papers, her eyes sharp as ever. She seemed determined to regain control of the situation and remind everyone that rules were still rules, regardless of who was involved. I took a deep breath and found a seat near the back, my wife by my side. She had agreed to attend the meeting with me, not to intimidate, but to help keep things civil and grounded in reality. The meeting began with the usual HOA business, landscaping rules, upcoming community events, and budget reports. But the mailbox incident was clearly on everyone's minds. When it was our turn to speak, Karen stood and addressed the room with practiced authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we have a situation that threatens the integrity of our community guidelines. The unauthorized relocation of a mailbox might seem trivial, but it's a slippery slope. If we allow one homeowner to bend the rules, where do we draw the line?" Her words echoed around the room, stirring murmurs of agreement from some neighbors. I could feel the weight of expectation pushing on me, the burden of being that guy who moved the mailbox without permission. When it was my turn, I stood up and spoke clearly. "I moved the mailbox 3 feet to improve safety for the neighborhood kids. The mail carrier has no trouble accessing it, and it doesn't change the look or feel of the street. I did not mean to defy the HOA or disrespect any rules. I believe safety and common sense should be part of how we interpret these guidelines." There was a ripple of reactions, some nodding, others skeptical. Then my wife spoke, her voice calm and commanding. "The role of any governing body, including this HOA, is to ensure the welfare of the community. But enforcement must be reasonable and fair. This isn't about ignoring rules, it's about applying them wisely." Karen's face tightened as she listened. "With all due respect, Chief, this isn't about reasonableness. It's about following the procedures that keep our community orderly." The conversation quickly grew heated. Karen and I exchanged pointed remarks about authority, community values, and respect for rules. But my wife's presence kept the debate from descending into chaos. Several neighbors stood to share their opinions. Some supported Karen's strict approach, worried about precedent and slippery slopes. Others sided with me, valuing practical safety over rigid bureaucracy. Then something unexpected happened. Mr. Delgado, a longtime resident known for his quiet wisdom, stood up and said, "We've all lived here for years, and we know our neighborhood has rules for a reason. But we also know that life isn't always black and white. Sometimes common sense needs to override rules. If this mailbox move keeps our kids safe, maybe that's what matters most." His words seemed to break the tension. The room quieted, and even Karen paused. The board ultimately decided to postpone any disciplinary action regarding the mailbox, opting instead to review the HOA guidelines on mailbox placement with input from residents, including myself. Walking home after the meeting, I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The tension hadn't vanished, but a crack had opened, a space where dialogue could happen instead of conflict. That night, I realized something important. Change is never easy, especially in a community bound by rules and traditions. But with patience, leadership, and a willingness to listen, even the most entrenched conflicts can begin to heal. The mailbox saga wasn't just about a mailbox anymore. It was about balancing rules with humanity, authority with empathy, and power with respect. And in that balance, maybe there was hope for our neighborhood and for all the little battles we face every day. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the mailbox drama had become the hot topic of the neighborhood, whispered in doorways and debated over fence lines. But what most residents didn't realize was that there was much more going on behind the scenes than anyone could see. Karen's relentless pursuit of the mailbox issue wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was deeply personal, and it was fueled by a network of alliances and tensions within the HOA board itself. And the more I learned, the clearer it became that the mailbox was just the tip of the iceberg. One afternoon, I met with Lisa, a neighbor who had quietly distanced herself from the HOA drama, but had a knack for knowing what was happening beneath the surface. Over coffee, she confided things that explained a lot about the HOA's inner workings. Karen's not just worried about a mailbox, Lisa said, lowering her voice. She's trying to tighten her grip on the board. The HOA has been struggling with leadership issues, factions forming, disagreements about spending, and a lot of gossip. Karen's using this situation to prove she's the one who can keep order. I was surprised. You mean she's using this to boost her influence? Lisa nodded. Exactly. She's painted you as a rule breaker to rally support. But a lot of people are tired of her style. Too rigid, too confrontational. As I digested this, I realized my mailbox move had unwittingly sparked a power struggle that went far beyond our street. Karen's quest for control was part of a larger battle over who called the shots in our community. The HOA board meetings were becoming a stage for these conflicts. Members argued over budgets for landscaping and security, while Karen pushed hard to enforce every rule in the book, sometimes selectively, depending on who was involved. What was worse, some board members were using the HOA's authority to settle personal scores or influence property values. The HOA, which was supposed to serve and protect all homeowners equally, was becoming a tool for politics. With my wife's guidance, I started to document what was happening. We talked about transparency and accountability, principles that should underpin any community governance. My wife, with her experience in law enforcement and public administration, encouraged me to bring these concerns to the forefront in the next HOA meeting. People need to see what's really going on, she said. Sometimes change starts by shining a light on the problem. In the weeks following my wife's intervention at the HOA meetings, the atmosphere in the neighborhood started to shift noticeably. What had been a battlefield turned into a forum for dialogue, and the tension that had gripped our community began to ease. It was almost like a breath of fresh air swept through the streets, quiet yet profound. Before, interactions with neighbors were often fraught with suspicion. People were watching each other, waiting for the next perceived infraction, the next opportunity to report a violation. Karen's constant scrutiny had made many residents wary. Even casual conversations carried an undertone of judgment. Now, however, something was different. Conversations grew warmer, more open. Neighbors greeted one another with genuine smiles, rather than forced politeness. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood's collective mood began to heal. I noticed it most during weekend walks. Folks who previously avoided eye contact now waved hello or stopped to chat. People were discussing community projects, sharing ideas about landscaping and neighborhood events. The mailbox incident, once a source of divisiveness, had become a catalyst for greater connection. At one block party, something that had not happened in years, residents gathered in the street, sharing food, stories, and laughter. Karen even made an appearance, though her demeanor was noticeably softer. She mingled cautiously, but she was there, showing signs of willingness to bridge the gaps that had divided us. One of the most significant moments came when Mr. Delgado, the wise neighbor who had spoken out during the HOA meeting, approached me. "I'm glad you stuck with this," he said. "It wasn't just about a mailbox, was it?" "No, not really," I admitted. "It was about respect, trust, and how we treat each other as neighbors." He nodded. "You helped remind us all that we're a community, not just a collection of houses. That makes all the difference." My wife's role as police chief played a big part in this change, too. People began to see her not just as an authority figure, but as a neighbor invested in the community's well-being. Her balanced approach to leadership, firm but fair, set an example that resonated beyond the HOA boardroom. Some residents who were initially skeptical even reached out to thank her for stepping in and helping restore harmony. It was humbling to witness the respect she earned, not through power, but through empathy and reason. But the transformation wasn't without challenges. There were still moments of friction, old habits dying slowly. Karen occasionally reverted to her strict enforcement style, but my wife's continued presence and the community's growing voice kept that in check. The HOA board, under new guidelines, began operating with more transparency. Meeting minutes were shared openly, residents were invited to participate, and decisions were made collaboratively. The power dynamic that once favored a few had begun to democratize. With the dust settling, the neighborhood embraced new projects: garden clubs, safety patrols, and neighborhood watch groups. The mailbox, once a flashpoint of conflict, became a symbol of how a small act of change can ripple outward to foster unity. Reflecting on it all, I realized this journey had been about more than just property lines or HOA rules. It was about learning to listen, to understand, and to build trust. Sometimes the loudest voices aren't the ones that lead to progress. It's the quiet, steady commitment to fairness and community that makes the real difference. And as I looked around at the neighbors laughing and talking together, I felt hopeful. We had moved beyond hostility and suspicion toward respect and connection. The mailbox saga had started a neighborhood transformation, and I knew we were just getting started. As the dust settled on what initially seemed like a trivial dispute over a mailbox, I found myself reflecting on the whirlwind of events that had unfolded over the past months. What started as a simple act, moving a mailbox 3 feet, had grown into a profound lesson about community, leadership, and resilience. The experience reshaped not only my perspective, but the entire neighborhood's dynamic. One of the biggest lessons I learned was how much power lies in communication and empathy. Before this all began, it was easy to see the HOA as an inflexible bureaucracy and Karen as an overbearing enforcer. But as I engaged more deeply with everyone involved, I realized that fear, control, and a desire for order often motivate people just as much as a genuine commitment to community. My wife's approach to the situation became a guiding example. Her leadership wasn't about issuing ultimatums or asserting dominance. It was about listening, fostering dialogue, and creating space for compromise. Her ability to see beyond the surface conflict and address the root causes helped steer the neighborhood toward healing. The HOA, once perceived as an adversary, transformed into a platform for constructive change. The reforms implemented under my wife's influence, transparency, accountability, and community involvement, became cornerstones for building trust. The board began to operate with greater openness, inviting resident input and making decisions collaboratively. I also learned that sometimes standing up for what's right means challenging the status quo, even when it's uncomfortable. Moving that mailbox wasn't about rebellion. It was about safety and common sense. But it took courage to face opposition, endure judgment, and keep pushing for fairness. More importantly, the neighborhood learned that rules exist to serve the people, not the other way around. Flexibility, context, and compassion are essential when interpreting and enforcing community guidelines. The mailbox incident became a symbol of that shift, a reminder that small changes can reveal larger truths. On a personal level, this journey strengthened my relationship with my wife. Her dual roles as my partner and the police chief showed me the importance of balance between authority and kindness. Together, we navigated conflict with mutual respect and a shared vision for a better community. Looking ahead, the neighborhood is no longer a place divided by suspicion and power struggles. Instead, it's a community where residents actively participate, support one another, and work toward common goals. Garden clubs, neighborhood watches, and regular social events have revitalized our streets. Karen, once the symbol of resistance, has found her own way to adapt. While she still cares deeply about rules, she's learned to listen and collaborate more. The transformation wasn't easy for anyone, but it showed that even the most entrenched players can grow. This story isn't just about a mailbox or HOA politics. It's about the power of leadership, community, and standing up for what matters. It's about how ordinary people can spark change when they act with courage, integrity, and empathy. As I look back on those early days of frustration and conflict, I'm grateful for the journey. It taught me that challenges often hide opportunities, and that through patience and perseverance, even the smallest actions can have a lasting impact. And now, when I glance at that mailbox, moved just 3 feet from where it used to be, I see more than a mailbox. I see a neighborhood that chose to grow, to listen, and to move forward together.